I didn't know you were coming today. My son Daniel said that while standing in the middle of my kitchen, holding a sledgehammer. Behind him, 3 construction workers were already ripping the cabinets off my walls. And my daughter-in-law Ashley looked at me calmly and said, "Don't worry, Margaret. You'll get used to the new layout." I looked down at the broken tiles on my kitchen floor. At my family photos packed into cardboard boxes. Then my eyes landed on a red folder sitting on the counter. When I saw the words power of attorney, my chest tightened. That was the moment I understood something terrifying. My son wasn't planning a renovation. He was planning to take my house. I looked at him. I froze. And for the first time in my life, I stopped being the nice mother. If this story speaks to you, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always read them. Now let me take you back to the beginning of that day, the day everything started to fall apart. That morning I was driving to my beach house in Hilton Head, South Carolina. After 40 years working as a nurse, I had planned one simple thing for myself. Peace. No hospital alarms. No night shifts. No hurried coffee between patients and paperwork. Just quiet mornings with the ocean breeze drifting through the windows. I imagined myself sitting on the back deck with a mug of coffee warming my hands while the sun rose slowly over the water. I had packed 2 novels, a small notebook, and a bag of groceries so I wouldn't even need to leave the house for a few days. It felt like a small reward for a long life of responsibility. The drive itself had always been one of my favorite parts. The road toward Hilton Head curves gently through miles of tall pines and marsh grass. The air grows softer there, warmer somehow, and it carries the faint smell of salt long before the ocean comes into view. I rolled down the window and let the wind move through the car. For the first time in months, my shoulders felt relaxed. I remember thinking how strange it was that quiet could feel so luxurious. When I turned onto the final road leading toward my property, I slowed down out of habit. The small houses along the street were exactly as I remembered them. Blue shutters. White fences. The same old bicycles leaning against porches. Everything looked peaceful. Completely ordinary. Then I noticed something unusual. The front door of my house was open. Not wide open. Just slightly. At first I frowned and tried to remember my last visit. Had I forgotten to lock it? That sort of thing happens when you get older. You double-check things, then 5 minutes later you can't quite remember if you actually did them. I told myself it was probably nothing. Still, a small uneasiness crept into my chest. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a white pickup truck parked near the porch. It didn't belong to me. For a moment I assumed it might belong to one of the neighbors. People in beach communities often help each other with small repairs, fixing fences, trimming branches, painting railings. It wasn't unusual to see unfamiliar vehicles from time to time. Back then, it seemed like a tiny detail. One of those things you notice but don't question. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. The morning was quiet. No voices. No music. Just the distant sound of waves and the soft creaking of tree branches in the breeze. If I had known what was happening inside my house at that exact moment, I might have stayed in the car a little longer. Or maybe I would have driven away entirely. But life rarely gives us that kind of warning. I stepped out of the car and walked toward the porch. The wooden boards groaned gently under my shoes, the same familiar sound they had made for years. When I reached the doorway, I paused. There was a strange smell in the air. Dust. Drywall. Something mechanical. Not the warm scent of salt and what I usually associated with the house. I pushed the door open a little wider. And that was when I heard the noise. A sharp cracking sound. Wood splitting. Metal clanging against tile. For a moment I simply stood there, confused. Then a man's voice echoed somewhere deeper inside the house. "Careful with that corner." Another loud crash followed. My stomach tightened. Slowly, I stepped inside. I had no idea that just a few steps ahead, in the kitchen I had carefully built and paid for over many years, strangers were already tearing it apart. And even worse. I had no idea that the person who gave them permission to do it was my own son. The first real sign of danger came the second I stepped into the kitchen. It wasn't just that something looked different. It looked violated. The upper cabinets had been removed so roughly that strips of paint and drywall still clung to the bare studs like torn skin. A saw whined somewhere behind me, and the sound bounced off the empty walls in a way that made my teeth ache. Someone had laid a blue tarp across the dining room floor, but it was already dusted with plaster and splinters. A man I didn't recognize walked past me carrying a bundle of wiring, as if I were a lamp he could step around. I smelled cut wood, hot metal, and that chalky dryness that gets into your throat when walls are opened. For a few seconds I couldn't speak. My mind kept insisting that I had walked into the wrong house. Then Daniel turned toward me. He was in jeans and a pale gray sweatshirt, like he'd simply come by to check the mail. The sledgehammer rested against his shoulder as casually as a golf club. "Mom," he said, smiling wide, "you made it." I stared at him. At my son. The boy I once rocked to sleep with my hand on his back. The boy who cried quietly into my cardigan the day we buried his father. "Daniel," I managed, "what is this?" He spread his free hand as if presenting a surprise party. "Surprise. We're remodeling." The word landed wrong. Too light for the damage in front of me. I took a step forward and looked down at the floor. Tiles had been pried up in jagged lines, exposing the thin gray underlayer beneath. My toes felt cold through my shoes, as if the house itself had lost warmth. "I didn't ask for remodeling," I said. Daniel's smile tightened, still there, but less natural. "It's a gift," he replied quickly. "You've been talking about updating this place for years." "I have never talked about tearing out my kitchen while I'm not here," I said, and I heard my voice sharpen in a way I didn't recognize. Ashley appeared behind him like she had been waiting for her cue. She wore clean white sneakers, no dust on them, and her hair was pulled back neatly as if this were a meeting, not a demolition. She held a coffee cup that looked like it had come from a cafe, and she sipped it with that calm expression that always made me feel slightly evaluated. "Margaret," she said softly, "this is going to be so much better. We're opening the space, bringing in light. It'll feel modern." Modern. As if my home was an outdated dress she could hem without asking. One of the workers dragged a cabinet carcass across the floor, and the screech made my stomach twist. I looked around and finally noticed the details I had been too stunned to see at first. My framed photographs, my late husband in his Navy uniform, Daniel at 8 years old holding a fishing pole, my own mother on her porch, had been taken down and stacked inside boxes in the hallway. Someone had labeled the boxes in thick black marker. Keep/donate/trash. I stared at that word, trash, until my eyes burned. Then I saw the paperwork on the counter. A neat stack, squared perfectly, as if the person who placed it there wanted it noticed. On top was a red folder. It looked too official for a construction site. Too clean. Too deliberate. I walked toward it without thinking, my feet moving before my mind caught up. My hands were shaking now, but not from fear, at least not only fear. I opened the folder. The words hit me like a hard slap. Power of attorney. I blinked once. Twice. My vision narrowed, tunneling to those 2 words. I had seen enough legal documents in my life, enough patient forms, enough end-of-life directives, to know what that meant. It meant control. Not help. Control. I looked up slowly. Daniel was still smiling, but he had gone very still. Ashley's eyes flicked to the folder, then back to my face, like she was measuring my reaction the way a nurse measures a pulse. "Why is this here?" I asked. Daniel took a step forward. "Mom, it's not what you think." My chest felt tight, as if someone had cinched a belt around my ribs. I held the folder in both hands. Then tell me what it is, I said quietly. And in that moment, standing among broken tiles, stripped walls, and my boxed-up memories, I understood something with a clarity that chilled me. This wasn't a renovation. It was the first strike of a takeover. I stood there with that red folder in my hands, and for a moment the noise of the construction disappeared, like someone had pressed a finger to my ears. All I could hear was my own breathing, thin, careful breaths that didn't seem to reach the bottom of my lungs. Daniel said something, my name, I think, but my mind had already started drifting. In moments like that, memories don't ask permission. They come the way a tide comes in, slow at first, then suddenly you realize you're standing ankle deep, and there's no dry sand left. I looked at my son, grown, broad-shouldered, holding a tool meant for breaking things, and my hands began to tremble the way they had many years ago, when I was younger and terrified and trying to pretend I wasn't. Daniel's father died when Daniel was 9. It wasn't dramatic. No long illness. No time to prepare. One morning my husband left for work with his lunch pail and a kiss on my cheek, and by afternoon there was a policeman in my living room, holding his hat in both hands the way men do when they bring bad news. I remember the sound my own voice made when I understood. It didn't even sound like me. It sounded like an animal. That night Daniel climbed into my bed without asking. He didn't cry loudly. He just pressed his face into my shoulder and breathed in little broken pulls, like he was trying to inhale safety. "I don't want you to go too," he whispered. And I made him a promise then. Not out loud, not formally, just deep inside my chest. I promised him I would not fall apart. I promised him he would not be hungry. He would not be ashamed. He would not feel what it was like to want something simple, shoes that fit, a coat that was warm, and know his mother couldn't afford it. So I became someone very efficient. I picked up extra shifts at the hospital. Doubles. Overnights. Holidays when other nurses went home to their families. I learned to sleep in short bursts and function anyway. I drank coffee that tasted like burnt paper and smiled at patients as if I had all the time in the world. I kept my grief folded away like clean laundry. Daniel grew up watching me do that, watching me choose duty over rest, responsibility over softness. And because he was my child, he came to believe that was what love looked like. Love was sacrifice. Love was never saying no. When he got into college, I paid the tuition without letting him see the panic I felt each time I wrote the checks. When his old car died, I helped him buy his first, reliable, one, telling myself it was an investment in his future. When he called from his first apartment and said he needed a deposit, by tomorrow, I made it happen. And the truth is, I was proud to do it. Not because I liked being needed, but because I liked seeing him safe. When Daniel asked me to come to dinner to meet someone special, I wore my best blouse and brought a lemon cake from the bakery, the one he used to beg for on his birthdays. Ashley opened the door with a bright smile and perfect hair and that polished ease some people seem to be born with. "Mrs. Parker," she said, taking the cake as if she'd been expecting it. "Daniel's told me so much about you." Then she corrected herself, laughing softly. "Sorry, Margaret. You're practically my mom already, right?" She called me Mom from the beginning, and at first I thought it was sweet. I thought it meant she wanted closeness, family, warmth. Now, standing in my half-destroyed kitchen, I understood something I hadn't understood then. Some people use warm words the way others use keys. They say them until the locks open. At their wedding, I paid for things I didn't offer to pay for, because Daniel looked stressed, and Ashley mentioned costs the way someone mentions weather, lightly but constantly. Chairs. Flowers. A photographer upgrade. A small honeymoon fund. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was normal. I told myself I was helping my son build a life. But even then, there were small moments, tiny splinters I ignored. Ashley's questions about property. About my retirement. About the beach house. "Must be nice," she said once, smiling as she looked out at the water. Owning a place like this. I laughed awkwardly and changed the subject, because I had spent my whole life changing the subject when something felt uncomfortable. And Daniel, my Daniel, started to change slowly, like a photograph fading. He became harder to reach. More distracted. More impatient when I asked simple questions. I noticed it, but I blamed myself. I thought, he's busy. He's building his life. Don't be clingy. Don't be a burden. And now here I was, watching strangers tear apart my home, realizing the burden they saw was not my neediness. It was my ownership. And when my mind finally returned fully to the present, the sound of cabinets being ripped away came back with it, louder than before. Like a warning I could no longer pretend not to hear. The first time I met Ashley, she seemed perfect. Polite. Charming. The kind of young woman who always knew exactly when to smile and exactly how long to hold someone's gaze. She brought flowers the first time she visited my home and complimented the curtains as if she had studied them in advance. "Mom, your house is beautiful," she said that evening while we sat at the kitchen table. She called me Mom so naturally that it almost made me blush. At the time, I thought Daniel had chosen well. After everything we had been through together, after the years of tight budgets and late-night homework and quiet dinners for two, I wanted him to have a life that felt easier than mine had been. Ashley seemed like that kind of life. Smooth. Bright. Successful. She laughed easily, spoke gently, and always offered to help clear the table after dinner. When Daniel looked at her, there was pride in his eyes, and that alone made me want to accept her completely. But there were small things that unsettled me. Not big things. Nothing dramatic enough to confront. Just tiny details that lingered in the back of my mind like the faint smell of smoke you can't quite locate. Ashley talked about money a lot. Not greedily, never directly. But frequently. She asked questions the way a careful investor might, softly, casually, but always precise. How much did homes cost here when you bought this place? What are property taxes like in Hilton Head? Beachfront property must be incredibly valuable now. Sometimes she asked Daniel those questions while I was standing right there, stirring something on the stove. Sometimes she asked me. She always smiled while asking, as if the questions were harmless curiosity. Once, while standing on the back deck and looking out at the ocean, she said something that made me pause. "Must be nice owning a place like this." Her tone was pleasant. Almost admiring. But there was a weight in the words that settled strangely in my chest. I laughed politely and told her the truth. It took many years of saving. She nodded slowly, her eyes drifting across the property like someone mentally measuring it. At the time, I told myself I was imagining things. After the wedding, Daniel slowly began to change. Not dramatically. Just little things. The kind of changes that happen so gradually you almost convince yourself they're normal. He used to call me every Sunday evening without fail. It had become a habit during his college years when he lived too far away to visit often. Even after he started working, he kept the routine. "Just checking in, Mom," he would say. Those calls began to disappear. First they moved to every other week. Then once a month. Eventually they came only when he needed advice about something practical, insurance forms, medical questions, taxes. I told myself that was normal. Children grow up. They build their own lives. But sometimes I would hear Ashley's voice in the background when we spoke. Quiet. Observing. She rarely said much during those calls, but I could always sense her presence. Sometimes Daniel would pause mid-sentence, as if listening to something she whispered nearby. Once, about a year after their wedding, my neighbor Mrs. Alvarez stopped me while I was bringing groceries inside. "I saw your son here yesterday," she said. I blinked. "Daniel?" "Yes," she replied casually. "He and his wife were in the yard with a tape measure. I thought maybe you were planning an addition." For a moment I didn't understand. "A tape measure?" "Yes," she said, smiling politely. They were measuring the side yard near the fence. I forced a small laugh. Oh. That must have been nothing. But later that evening I sat at my kitchen table thinking about it. Daniel had not mentioned visiting. Ashley had not mentioned it either. Why would they measure the yard without telling me? The question stayed with me longer than I wanted to admit. Then other small moments began to surface in my memory. Ashley once asked if I had ever considered selling the beach house. Another time she asked whether my retirement accounts were hard to manage alone. She said it kindly. Concerned. Like a daughter who was simply worried about an aging parent. Handling finances can get overwhelming, she once said gently. It's good when someone younger helps keep things organized. At the time, I nodded politely. I even thanked her for caring. Looking back now, I realize how carefully those conversations were placed. Always casual. Always friendly. But always circling the same subjects. Money. Property. Control. Another memory returned to me then. One evening during dinner, Ashley asked Daniel something that seemed harmless at the time. Did your mom ever set up a will? Daniel laughed awkwardly. Why would I know that? Ashley shrugged lightly. Just thinking about the future. The comment passed quickly. But the room had grown strangely quiet for a moment. And now, standing in the middle of my demolished kitchen while workers tore apart the walls around me, those small conversations returned one by one. Like puzzle pieces sliding slowly into place. And suddenly they didn't feel small anymore. They felt like the beginning of a plan. A plan that had started long before the first cabinet came off my wall. Long before that red power of attorney folder appeared on my kitchen counter. And the worst part was this. I had seen the warning signs. I had simply chosen not to believe them. When my thoughts finally returned to the present, the noise of the construction rushed back into my ears all at once. A hammer struck wood. Something heavy crashed against the floor. Dust floated through the air in pale clouds that caught the sunlight coming through the window above the sink. The smell of drywall and fresh splinters filled my throat, making every breath taste dry and bitter. For a moment I simply stood there, still holding the red folder in my hands. The words power of attorney seemed heavier now. Daniel was watching me closely. Not with the relaxed confidence he had shown earlier. Now there was something tight in his posture, as if he were waiting to see whether I would panic, or cooperate. Ashley, on the other hand, had already turned away and was speaking to one of the workers as if nothing unusual were happening. Careful with that wall, she said, pointing with her coffee cup. We're opening the space here, but that beam needs to stay. Opening the space. The phrase made my stomach twist. Daniel cleared his throat. Mom, we were actually planning to talk to you about all of this today. I looked at him slowly. Planning? Well, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. We wanted it to be a surprise. I gestured toward the destroyed kitchen. This is your idea of a surprise? Ashley stepped forward then, her expression calm and almost patient, like someone explaining something obvious to a child. Margaret, she said gently, we're trying to help you. The words sounded kind. But they didn't feel kind. Help me do what? I asked quietly. Daniel shifted his weight. Look, Mom, you've been living alone for a long time. Managing 2 properties isn't easy. The beach house needs updates, and we figured it would make more sense if we all lived here together. The room went strangely quiet. Even the workers seemed to slow their movements for a moment, glancing in our direction before returning to their tools. You're moving in, I said. Daniel nodded. Yeah. Permanently. Ashley smiled slightly, as if this were the most natural idea in the world. It'll be good for everyone, she added smoothly. You won't have to worry about maintenance anymore, and we'll help manage things. Manage things. I looked down again at the folder in my hands. At the legal document that would allow someone to control another person's property. Another person's money. Another person's life. My fingers tightened around the edge of the paper. When exactly, I asked slowly, did I agree to any of this? Daniel hesitated. Well, technically you didn't yet. Ashley answered before he could continue. That's what the paperwork is for. Her tone was calm. Practical. Almost cheerful. It's just a power of attorney document, she explained. Very common for families. It allows Daniel to help handle your finances and property decisions if things ever become complicated. Complicated. The word echoed in my mind. I felt a cold wave move slowly through my body. Not panic. Something colder than panic. Clarity. The kind that comes when a puzzle suddenly begins to make sense. I looked around the kitchen again. The ripped cabinets. The broken tiles. The workers already halfway through a demolition I had never approved. The boxes filled with my photographs and dishes. My life, carefully packed away like clutter. Then I looked back at my son. And for the first time, I saw something I had never seen before. Not the little boy who used to crawl into my bed after thunderstorms. Not the teenager who asked me for advice before his first job interview. I saw a man standing inside a house he believed would soon belong to him. That realization settled into my chest like ice. And suddenly the small memories from the past few years came rushing back. Ashley asking about the value of the property. Daniel measuring the yard without telling me. Those quiet conversations about retirement, about finances, about making things easier. None of it had been casual. None of it had been harmless curiosity. It had been preparation. This renovation wasn't a surprise. It was a step in a plan. A plan that had clearly been discussed long before I drove down that quiet road toward my beach house that morning. I looked again at the folder. Power of attorney. With that single document, Daniel could sell my property. Take loans against it. Move money from my accounts. Make decisions in my name. Without my permission. The realization settled over me slowly. This wasn't a renovation. It wasn't even a misunderstanding. It was a takeover. And the most frightening part wasn't the destruction around me. It was the quiet confidence in Daniel's eyes. The confidence of someone who believed the decision had already been made. Someone who believed his mother would eventually do what she had always done. Agree. Because for 72 years, I had been the kind of woman who avoided conflict. The kind of mother who sacrificed first and questioned later. The kind of person who kept the peace, even when something felt wrong. Daniel knew that. Ashley knew it too. They were counting on it. But as I stood there holding that folder while strangers tore apart my kitchen, something unfamiliar began to settle in my chest. Not fear. Something steadier. Something colder. For the first time in my life, I was no longer thinking about how to keep everyone comfortable. I was thinking about how to protect what was mine. The next morning I woke before the sun. For a few seconds I didn't move. I simply lay there listening to the quiet, staring at the ceiling while the events of the previous day settled back into my mind like dust after a storm. The house no longer sounded the same. Normally, mornings in Hilton Head were gentle. You could hear distant waves, the soft wind moving through the trees, sometimes a bird calling from the marsh. The house itself had always made small comforting sounds, with settling, pipes humming quietly as the day began. But that morning the silence felt strained. Unnatural. Like a house that had been forced to hold its breath. I sat up slowly and looked around the guest bedroom where I had slept. The walls were bare. Even here I could smell the faint dryness of construction dust drifting through the hallway. My throat felt tight, and the memory of splintering wood from the day before still echoed somewhere in my chest. For a long time I simply sat there. Then I stood, wrapped a robe around my shoulders, and walked quietly toward the kitchen. The red folder was still sitting exactly where Daniel had left it on the counter. Power of attorney. During the night I had read every page. Slowly. Carefully. Twice. Each paragraph had been written in clean legal language, calm, reasonable, almost harmless if you didn't look closely. But the meaning was simple. With that document signed, Daniel would control everything. My house. My bank accounts. My retirement savings. Even medical decisions if things ever became complicated. I closed the folder and placed it back on the counter exactly where it had been. Then I made coffee. The familiar routine felt strangely comforting. The quiet bubbling of the machine, the smell of fresh coffee filling the kitchen, it reminded me that despite the chaos around me, I was still in control of at least this moment. I sat at the table and waited. At exactly 6 a.m., two black SUVs turned slowly into the driveway. Their headlights swept across the windows before the engines shut off at the same time. A moment later the doorbell rang. Upstairs I heard movement. Daniel. Ashley reached the door first. Her voice carried into the hallway. Yes? Can I help you? A calm male voice answered. Good morning. We're looking for Mr. Daniel Parker. Ashley hesitated. And who are you? By then Daniel had come halfway down the stairs, still wearing the gray t-shirt he had slept in. His hair was messy, his face still groggy from sleep. What's going on? He asked. Two men stepped inside. They wore dark jackets and carried leather folders. Their expressions were neutral, professional. Behind them stood someone Daniel clearly did not expect to see. My attorney. Robert Hayes. Daniel stopped moving. Mom? Ashley turned toward me, confusion already sharpening her voice. What is this? Robert removed his glasses and wiped them calmly with a handkerchief before speaking. Mr. Parker, he said in a measured tone, you are being formally served several legal notices this morning. One of the officers stepped forward and handed Daniel a thick packet of documents. Daniel frowned as he looked down at them. What is this supposed to be? First, Robert continued, an eviction notice issued by the legal owner of this property. Daniel blinked. What? Second, Robert said, placing another document on the counter, a cease and desist order regarding unauthorized demolition and structural damage performed yesterday. Ashley let out a short, incredulous laugh. That's ridiculous, she snapped. This is family property. Robert didn't raise his voice. According to county records, the property belongs solely to Margaret Parker. The room became very still. Daniel looked slowly from the papers in his hands, to me. There must be some mistake. There is no mistake, Robert replied. He placed another document on the counter. A lawsuit has also been filed regarding property damage caused by yesterday's demolition. Ashley's voice rose immediately. You're suing your own son. I didn't answer. Not yet. Daniel looked around the destroyed kitchen, the broken floor tiles, the missing cabinets, the exposed beams, and then back down at the paperwork. His confidence from the previous day had completely disappeared. The man who had stood in my kitchen with a sledgehammer now looked confused. Uneasy. Like someone who had stepped onto ice that suddenly began to crack beneath his feet. Then Robert reached into his folder again. There is one additional matter. He placed several printed pages beside the red folder. These are text messages obtained during a preliminary legal review. Ashley's eyes flicked quickly toward the papers. Daniel's face had already gone pale. Robert lifted one sheet and read aloud. She'll just have to accept it. The house will be mine anyway. The words hung in the air like smoke. Ashley froze. Daniel stared at the paper as if the sentence might somehow disappear if he looked hard enough. But it didn't. For the first time since I had walked into my destroyed kitchen the day before, neither of them had anything to say. The truth had stepped fully into the room. And now everyone standing there could see it. 2 days later, they were gone. The house was quiet again. Not the peaceful quiet I had imagined when I first retired, but a hollow kind of silence that echoed through every room. The workers had packed up their tools the same afternoon the legal papers were served. Their trucks disappeared down the street, leaving behind a half-finished demolition and a kitchen that looked like the aftermath of a storm. For the first time in decades, the house felt unfamiliar to me. The cabinets were gone. The floor had been torn open in long rough lines where the tiles had once been neatly laid. A section of drywall leaned against the dining room wall like something abandoned in the middle of a job that would never be finished. Everywhere I looked, there were signs of interruption. Plans that had started without permission and ended just as abruptly. Dust covered the counters and drifted across the floor like pale gray snow. The smell of fresh wood and broken plaster hung stubbornly in the air, and even when I opened the windows, the scent refused to leave. I walked slowly through the kitchen that afternoon, careful where I stepped. The house creaked around me, unfamiliar now, like it was adjusting to the sudden emptiness. My photographs were still stacked inside cardboard boxes. Someone had written keep, donate, and trash across the sides in thick black marker. The words made something tighten in my chest. I opened the nearest box and lifted one frame carefully. It was a picture of Daniel when he was 8 years old. He was standing on a wooden dock holding a fishing pole nearly twice his height. His smile stretched wide across his face, proud of the small fish dangling from the line. His front teeth were missing, and his hair stuck up in every direction because he had refused to let me comb it before we left the house that morning. "Mom, fish don't care about hair," he had said. For a long time I simply held the photograph. The boy in that picture felt like someone I still knew. But the man who had stood in my kitchen with a sledgehammer felt like a stranger. I sat down slowly in one of the dining room chairs. The quiet wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. And for the first time since everything had begun, I cried. Not loud sobs. Not dramatic grief. Just quiet tears that slid down my face while I sat there holding that photograph in my hands. I wasn't crying for the house. The house could be repaired. Wood can be replaced. Walls can be rebuilt. But something else had been broken in those 2 days. Something much harder to fix. I had spent 72 years believing I understood my own son. Believing I knew the shape of his heart because I had helped build it. I had watched him grow from a small frightened boy who climbed into my bed after his father died, into a man who believed my home was something he could simply take. That realization hurt in a way I had not expected. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even betrayal. It was grief. The quiet, heavy grief that comes when you realize someone you love no longer exists in the form you remember. I wiped my eyes after a while and carefully placed the photograph back into the box. Outside, the ocean breeze moved softly through the trees. The sound reminded me that the world had not stopped. Life was continuing, quietly, just beyond the walls of my damaged kitchen. The legal process moved forward quickly after that. Daniel and Ashley had no legal claim to the property. The construction company confirmed they had been hired without my authorization. Within a few weeks, the court ordered Daniel to pay $40,000 in damages for the destruction. I did not attend the hearing. My lawyer handled everything. There was nothing left for me to say. The repairs took several months. New cabinets were installed. The broken flooring was replaced. Fresh paint covered the scars where the walls had been cut open. Slowly, the house began to look like itself again. The kitchen smelled of clean wood instead of dust. Sunlight once again reflected softly across the polished counters. From the outside, everything looked restored. But something inside me had quietly changed. The woman who once avoided conflict at all costs was gone. In her place stood someone quieter. Someone calmer. Someone who finally understood that kindness without boundaries can become an invitation for someone else to take everything you have. And once you learn that lesson, you never forget it. The court ordered Daniel to pay $40,000 in damages. It took him almost a year. I didn't follow every step of the process closely. My lawyer handled the legal details, and I allowed the distance to remain. At my age, you learn that not every battle needs your daily attention. Some things move forward quietly on their own. But once a month, a payment arrived. Sometimes on time. Sometimes late. Each check felt strange in my hands. Not satisfying. Not triumphant. Just heavy. Money has a different weight when it comes from someone who once called you mom with complete trust in his voice. During those months, the house slowly returned to life. The repairs were careful and patient. The construction company, under the supervision of my lawyer this time, replaced the cabinets Daniel's workers had destroyed. New flooring was installed where the tiles had been ripped apart. Fresh paint softened the scars where the walls had been opened. At first, I walked through the rooms cautiously, as if the house might still be fragile. But gradually, the sounds of normal life returned. The quiet hum of the refrigerator. The soft creak of the floorboards at night. The ocean breeze moving through the open windows in the afternoon. I began drinking my morning coffee on the back deck again. The same place where I had imagined peaceful retirement before everything happened. The same place Ashley once stood while saying, "Must be nice owning a place like this." One morning, nearly 9 months after the court ruling, a letter arrived. The envelope was plain. Daniel's handwriting on the front looked hesitant, uneven in places like someone had written slowly and carefully. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No long explanation. No dramatic apology. Just one sentence written in blue ink. "Thank you for not letting me become the man I almost became." I read the sentence 3 times. Then I folded the letter and placed it inside the same drawer where I kept old family photographs. Later, through relatives and mutual friends, I learned pieces of what had happened after the court case. Daniel and Ashley divorced not long after the legal proceedings ended. Apparently the pressure of the lawsuit, the financial penalties, and the public embarrassment had torn their marriage apart faster than either of them expected. Daniel moved to another city. He began therapy. At least that's what my sister told me one afternoon during a phone call. I didn't ask many questions. Some stories don't need every detail. What mattered most had already happened. The house was repaired. The ocean breeze returned. And slowly, the silence inside those walls changed. At first it had felt empty. Now it felt peaceful. Not because everything was the same as before. But because I had finally learned something I should have understood years earlier. Peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict. Sometimes it comes from facing it. From protecting what belongs to you, even when the person standing across from you is someone you once held in your arms as a child. Some evenings I still walk along the shoreline just before sunset. The air smells of salt and warm sand, and the waves roll in with the same steady rhythm they always have. Life continues. Quietly. And for the first time in many years, the quiet no longer feels fragile. It feels earned. For most of my life, I believed that love meant giving. Giving time. Giving money. Giving patience even when it hurt. I believed that if you sacrificed enough, the people you loved would naturally value what you gave them. But life has a quiet way of teaching difficult lessons. Sometimes love does not mean giving everything away. Sometimes love means drawing a line. Sometimes it means saying no, even when the person standing in front of you is your own child. Because boundaries are not cruelty. They are protection. Protection for your home. For your dignity. And for the life you spent decades building with your own hands. Some names and small details in this story have been changed for privacy. But the lesson is very real. And now I want to ask you something. Do you think Margaret did the right thing? Tell me what you would have done in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, stay here for the next one.